Hey everybody, this is Ginger, and I'd intended for this video to discuss a little bit more about modern feminism in the West and its impact on society, but here we are instead, talking about Orwellian thought police and censorship. For those of you who have not read 1984, and if you haven't, you should, we are living it. Google's new policy is the thought police at work. And while they say that their policy is about making the internet a better place and protecting children by teaching them how to participate safely and responsibly, and if you've ever watched To Catch a Predator, you know that's a necessary thing, that it's about counterterrorism, which I think we all can agree that groups like ISIS, we need to be able to kind of curtail their recruitment tools. What it also does, as they tell you here, we'll soon be applying tougher treatment to videos that aren't illegal but have been flagged by users as potential violations of our policies on hate speech and violent extremism. If we find these videos don't violate our policies but contain controversial religious or supremacist content, they will be placed in a limited state. The videos will remain on YouTube behind an interstitial, won't be recommended, won't be monetized, and won't have key features including comments, suggested videos, and likes. And the problem with that is that they don't define controversial religious or supremacist content, but we know, because of the groups that they're working with, that what they consider controversial is anything that might be critical of one particular religion, and it's not Christianity, it's not Hinduism, it's not Sikhism, draw your own conclusions, and what they deem supremacist, which is anything that doesn't agree with a very particular political ideology. What they're saying in a nutshell is that content creators' speech may not violate the law, it may not violate Google's terms of service, and there may not be any valid complaints about content such as it's clearly inciting violence or it's clearly intended to do real harm to someone's career or reputation, and those are situations for which there are legal and constitutional remedies, but Google's going to effectively censor it simply because they, as a corporation working in tandem with organizations with known issues defending and protecting people's civil rights, disagree with the opinions expressed by those content creators. Now again, I think we can all agree that no state actor or private entity has any obligation to protect the speech or recruitment abilities of any terrorist group. In fact, international law prohibits war propaganda, and we can loosely interpret the social media efforts of terror groups to fit under that definition of war propaganda. And Google themselves, in a public policy blog on technology and human rights, refers to the importance of Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that says everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. And what Google says in their policy is that it's exciting to see people exercise their rights to freely express themselves and access information across borders and media. Now, what Google's not telling you is that Article 19 was codified into international law via treaty, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The U.S. signed this in October 1977, it ratified it in June of 1992, and it became effective in the United States in September of 1992, regardless of whether or not the United States has actually abided by it. And the United States was particularly strident in its insistence that none of the treaty's articles should restrict the right of free speech and expression and free association. What Google also isn't telling you is that there's legislation that protects Google and YouTube from the content that users post. It's called the Communication Decency Act. And while it was originally written to limit free expression on the internet to that which the Supreme Court has protected, it does contain a section that provides protection for content hosts if content creators post content that is problematic, and that section is 230. It reads, "No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider." What that basically means is, if a creator posts content that violates the law, Google cannot be held legally or civilly responsible, and neither can the ISP. And I agree with that. Google and the ISP aren't condoning or endorsing the views, they're merely providing the transmission and the platform on which those creators can exercise their rights. Similarly, we see cities like Monterey and agencies like the National Park Service creating First Amendment areas with signs stating that the views of the individuals who are exercising their rights are not necessarily the views of the government, nor does the government necessarily endorse those views. The government's merely providing a place in which folks may assemble, express their views, or even protest if that is what they wish wish to do. Now, legal scholars are also debating whether there is a public interest argument to be made here or not. YouTube, though it is a part of Google, which is a private company, has operated as a very public community for the past 12 years. And so some have argued that cases such as Marsh versus Alabama may be applicable here. In Marsh, which involved a woman distributing religious pamphlets on a sidewalk that was owned by public corporation but open to and widely used by the general public, Justice Hugo Black wrote for the majority, "A traveler may make free use of the facilities available there. In short, the town and its shopping district are accessible to and freely used by the public." Our question then narrows down to this: can those people be denied freedom of press and religion simply because a single company has legal title to all the town? And this is a First Amendment question, so you can also include freedom of speech and expression. For it is the state's contention that a mere fact that all property interests in the town are held by a single company is enough to give that company power to abridge those freedoms. We do not agree that the corporation's property interests settle the question. The state urges, in effect, that the corporation's right to control is coextensive with the right of a homeowner to regulate the conduct of his guests. We cannot accept that contention. Ownership does not always mean absolute dominion. The more an owner, for his advantage, opens up his property for use by the public in general, the more do his rights become circumscribed by the statutory and constitutional rights of those who use it. Whether a corporation owns or possesses, the public in either case has an identical interest in the functioning of the community in such a manner that the channels of communication remain free. Now, I've asked an attorney who admits that this is not his area of expertise, and his stance is that yes, there is a public interest argument that could be made here along the same lines as the Supreme Court's decision in Marsh, and that public interest argument could potentially override Google's stance as a private corporation because of the fact that for over a decade, Google has allowed the public free and unfettered access to openly express themselves within the bounds of what the Supreme Court has said is protected speech under the First Amendment on an open platform. Courts have already struck down ISP's arguments that blocking and limiting access to content is a violation of First Amendment rights to control what they transmit and host. So I'm curious, given Section 230 of the CDA, international law, Marsh, previous decisions striking down these arguments, how will Google's hypocrisy and thought policing here play out in the long run with the courts, especially the Supreme Court, since it rules almost entirely based on precedent? Listen, I'm neither liberal nor conservative. My views are really closer to the center because I'm a firm believer in fiscal responsibility, but I also don't believe there's any such thing as identity politics and rights that are associated. I believe there are human rights, period. If you're a human being, you have the right to be treated as a human being with all of the freedoms and liberties that entails. You have the right to marry or not, worship whoever you want or not worship at all, the right to have a family. You also have the right to express yourself freely, but you don't have the right to not be offended. There are liberal people and liberal icons, really, with whom I disagree on quite a lot politically, but not on the idea of the importance of freedom of speech and expression. And here's what they have to say about this issue.
I know there are some who ask, why don't we just ban such a video? And the answer is enshrined in our laws. Our Constitution protects the right to practice free speech. Here in the United States, countless publications provoke offense. Like me, the majority of Americans are Christian, and yet we do not ban blasphemy against our most sacred beliefs. As President of our country and Commander-in-Chief of our military, I accept that people are going to call me awful things every day. And I will always defend their right to do so. Americans have fought and died around the globe to protect the right of all people to express their views, even views that we profoundly disagree with. We do not do so because we support hateful speech, but because our founders understood that without such protections, the capacity of each individual to express their own views and practice their own faith may be threatened. We do so because in a diverse society, efforts to restrict speech can quickly become a tool to silence critics and oppress minorities. We do so because, given the power of faith in our lives and the passion that religious differences can inflame, the strongest weapon against hateful speech is not repression. It is more speech. The voices of tolerance that rally against bigotry and blasphemy and lift up the values of understanding and mutual respect.
Listen, we live in America, and in America we have the freedom to express ourselves. We shouldn't take that for granted. So whatever the movements are, whether you agree with them or don't, they have the right to express themselves. So that's one of the great things about being in this country, that you do have the right.
Senator Rubio pointed out, he said that when people try to stop free speech, stop people from talking, it creates pressure in the system that might cause people to act out. What do you think of that theory?
I think he's right. Look, freedom of speech, the right to dissent, the right to protest, that is what America is about.
Where do you come down on that in the context of this pressure on free speech?
I think people have a right to speak. And you have a right, if you're on a college campus, not to attend. You have a right to ask hard questions about the speaker if you disagree with him or her. But why should we be afraid of somebody coming on a campus or any place else and speaking? You have a right to protest. But I don't quite understand why anybody thinks it's a good idea to deny somebody else the right to express his or her point of view.
Look, the purpose is not just, as I said before, to transmit skills. It's also to widen your horizons, to make you a better citizen, to help you to evaluate information, to help you make your way through the world, to help you be more creative. The way to do that is to create a space where a lot of ideas are presented and collide, and people are having arguments, and people are testing each other's theories, and over time, people learn from each other because they're getting out of their own narrow point of view and having a broader point of view. Suddenly, there were some folks who didn't think at all like me. And if I had an opinion about something, they'd look at me and say, well, that's stupid. And then they'd describe how they saw the world. And they might have had a different sense of politics, or they might have a different view about poverty, or they might have a different perspective on race. And sometimes their views would be infuriating to me. But it was because there was this space where you could interact with people who didn't agree with you and had different backgrounds than you, that I then started testing my own assumptions. And sometimes I changed my mind. Sometimes I realized, you know what, maybe I've been too narrow-minded. Maybe I didn't take this into account. Maybe I should see this person's perspective. The idea that you'd have somebody making a decision about what you should think ahead of time or what you should be taught, and if it's not the right thought or idea or perspective or philosophy, runs contrary to everything we believe. I mean, I guess that might work in the Soviet Union, but it doesn't work here. That's not who we are. That's not what we're about. Now, one thing I do want to point out is it's not just sometimes folks who are mad that colleges are too liberal that have a problem. Sometimes, you know, there are folks on college campuses who are liberal and maybe even agree with me on a bunch of issues who sometimes aren't listening to the other side. And that's a problem too. You know, I don't agree that you have to be coddled and protected from different points of view. Anybody who comes to speak to you and you disagree with, you should have an argument with them. But you shouldn't silence them by saying you can't come because, you know, I'm too sensitive to hear what you have to say. That's not the way we learn either.
Speaking personally, I have very little to complain about where my freedom of expression is concerned. And the Harry Potter books have figured frequently on lists of the most banned. But as such lists feature many of my favorite writers, I've always been very flattered to be included. Of course, I can afford to take these things lightly, protected as I am by citizenship of a liberal nation where freedom of expression is a fundamental right. My critics are at liberty to claim that I'm trying to convert children to Satanism, and I'm free to explain that I'm exploring human nature and morality, or to say you're an idiot, depending on which side of the bed I got out of that day. However, I've never taken these freedoms for granted. In fact, I worry that we may be in danger of allowing their erosion through sheer complacency. The tides of populism and nationalism currently sweeping many developed countries have been accompanied by demands that unwelcome and inconvenient voices be removed from public discourse. Intolerance of alternative viewpoints is spreading to places that make me, a moderate and a liberal, most uncomfortable. Only last year, we saw an online petition to ban Donald Trump from entry to the UK. Now, I find almost everything that Mr. Trump says objectionable. I consider him offensive and bigoted, but he has my full support to come to my country and be offensive and bigoted there. His freedom to speak protects my freedom to call him a bigot. His freedom guarantees mine. Unless we take that absolute position without caveats or apologies, we have set foot upon a road with only one destination. If my offended feelings can justify a travel ban on Donald Trump, I have no moral grounds on which to argue that those offended by feminism, or the fight for transgender rights, or universal suffrage should not oppress campaigners for those causes. If you seek the removal of freedoms from an opponent simply on the grounds that they have offended you, you have crossed a line to stand alongside tyrants who imprison, torture, and kill on exactly the same justification.
Censorship in any form is wrong. And because Google is promoting the idea of censorship of anything, but especially of the ideas that they disagree with, Google has earned their spot in the asshole Olympics.